Good evening. I'm Jim Duff, Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and it's my honor to welcome you to the Society's virtual lecture platform this evening. While the Supreme Court building remains closed to the public, the Society has pivoted to a very active series of lectures and discussions over Zoom. It's been a bright light during the pandemic to be able to do so and connect our programs to members who might not otherwise travel to Washington, D.C. And we can plan to continue to do programs over Zoom in this format, even after we return to programming at the court building itself. Tonight's program focuses on the publication of Professor Brad Snyder's book, Democratic Justice, Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court, and the Making of the Liberal Establishment. It was published in August, just recently. He is joined in conversation by Professor Laura Kalman. I will be very brief with their introductions this evening in order to allot more time to their conversation, which promises to be very interesting and stimulating. Brad Snyder is a professor of law and the Anne Fleming Research Professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. He teaches constitutional law, constitutional history, and sports law. In addition to his new volume on Felix Frankfurter, he is the author of The House of Truth, a Washington political salon and the foundations of American liberalism, and A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports. He was a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellow in Constitutional Studies in 2019, a fellowship, by the way, that is funded by the Society's Vice President, Dorothy Tapper Goldman. He's a stalwart friend of the Society, delivering lectures, offering guidance, and is a member of the Supreme Court Board of Editors for the Society's Journal of Supreme Court History. Laura Kalman is Distinguished Research Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's a member of the California Bar and past president of the American Society for Legal History. She was also a member of the Journal of Supreme Court History's Board of Editors for many years. Her work in legal history is extensive. Her most recent book, FDR's Gambit on the Court Packing Plan of 1937, was published just this last month. She is the author of The Long Reach of the 60s, LBJ, Nixon, and the Making of the Contemporary Supreme Court, Right Star Rising, A New Politics, 1974 to 1980, and Abe Fortas, a biography, which was the winner of the 1991 Littleton Griswold Prize. We will take questions from our audience near the end of the program, so please submit your questions in the Q&A window of Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can. Professors, the Society's virtual floor is now yours, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Well, as Brad knows, I'm not a fan of Felix Frankfurter, but I am a fan of this book. I love this book for its command of the archival sources, for its provocative revisionism, and for its page-turning narrative. So I thought we might get into it by your telling us about his early years.
Sure, Laura. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Jim for his introduction to the Society, for having me for the umpteenth time, for Jennifer Lowe for all of her work behind the scenes, which is like herding two law professors and getting them on the same page is a little like herding cats, and she's amazing at it. And lastly, I just want to thank you, Laura. I read your biography of Abe Fortas when I was in law school. Judge Richard Posner called it the best judicial biography ever written. So your work is an exemplar for the rest of us. And I would just encourage everyone to go out and buy FDR's Gambit, because it's the same high level work that you've been producing for years and years. So thank you so much for doing this for me. It's a huge honor, and I wanted your skepticism in this conversation. You know, it would be boring to have a Frankfurter love fest at the Supreme Court Historical Society. So I hope we can have a back and forth about Felix, kind of warts and all. Is a good way to have a discussion. Felix's early life is really an amazing American story. He arrived in this country from Vienna, Austria at age 11. He couldn't speak a word of English, and he had never heard one spoken. And he arrived at PS 25 in Lower Manhattan in a German-speaking neighborhood. And he credits his teacher at PS 25, a woman named Miss Annie Hogan, with his Americanization, because she threatened his classmates with corporal punishment if they spoke to him in German. And so he really believed in this idea of the public school as this socializing and Americanizing function, and his rise was really rapid. It's a kind of classic American success story. From PS 25, he goes to CCNY's combined high school and college program. And for those of you who don't know, that was a free combined high school and college program, and it attracted so many recent immigrants and children of recent immigrants into the school who were striving for better lives. And Felix finished third in his class at CCNY. And after a year of working for the city of New York, he went to Harvard Law School. And Harvard was really the life changer for him.
What did Harvard Law School do for him? And
Well,
how did it influence him?
yeah, I mean, I think one big theme of my book is that Felix was a networker and a creator of professional networks. And I feel like Harvard Law School was the place where he established his initial network, not just with professors, of which, of course, he impressed many. He was really a generational talent as a student. He finished first in his class all 3 years at Harvard. In those days at Harvard Law School, between 30 to 40% of the first year class failed out. Everyone was judged on grades alone. And so Felix rose to the top. He impressed his professors. He impressed the dean of the law school, James Barr Ames. And he was also a member of the Harvard Law Review. And he really treasured being a member of the Harvard Law Review and made very intimate friendships with his classmates on the Harvard Law Review. So that group of Harvard Law Review editors really became his first major professional network. And lastly, I would just say, in terms of his judicial philosophy, Harvard Law School was where he discovered a famous essay by James Bradley Thayer from 1893 about judicial review, in which Thayer argues that when federal laws are concerned, that the Supreme Court should not overturn a federal law unless it is unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. And Thayer, I know you want to jump in, Laura, but they are very much interested in and sort of inspired by John Marshall's opinion in McCulloch versus Maryland, believed in a kind of a capacious federal power, and really that the court's default should be one of deference when it came to that federal power. And that really appealed to Frankfurter.
I noticed that in the justice's papers that any time a new justice came to the court from Harvard Law School, Frankfurter would send an inquiry to Harvard about its grades.
Yeah, he was a great
Do you think he maybe had a little too much faith in Harvard Law School as the birthplace of meritocracy?
Well, I'd say the answer is yes. Well, let's just state the obvious. Harvard Law School excluded women, right? For decades and decades. It was not there were a few African-American students at Harvard Law School, but very few. the first African-American on the Harvard Law Review, Charles Hamilton Houston, and the second one, William Hastie, were both Frankfurter students, but it was a white male institution. So calling it a meritocracy, although it was grade driven only, has those important caveats. It was a meritocracy according to the definition of the early 20th century, but now we wouldn't think so. But on the other hand, Laura, I get what you're saying, but he would try to find out how people did at Harvard Law School. But let's just bring up one of my favorite justices, Harold Burton, right? He found out that Harold Burton was a mediocre student, a low C man at Harvard Law School, and he didn't care a bit because he thought Harold Burton was wise and fair and open-minded and willing to change his mind if he heard a legal argument that was persuasive to him. And Frankfurter had an enormous amount of admiration and respect for Harold Burton throughout their time on the court together. So I think he recognized that grades weren't the be all and end all, but certainly it had such a transformative, his finishing at the first in his class had a transformative effect on his life, Laura, because at the time, just to put it in context, Wall Street law firms, most of them didn't hire Jews. And the only way Felix got hired at one was from a set of very tiny recommendations on very tiny cards from the dean of Harvard Law School, James Barr Ames. Felix would take these sealed cards to the law firms, and one of the anti-Semitic lawyers says, in Felix's presence, that looks like Ames's handwriting. And he was just sort of astonished, right? And then the other thing Ames did for him was he recommended him, and this was the big life-changing event, because Felix lasts about 3 months or less at one of these Wall Street firms. He recommends him to Henry Stimson, who's the new head federal prosecutor of the Southern District of New York. Stimson doesn't have a lot of money in terms of budget. He wants to hire the youngest but best and brightest young recent law graduates, and Ames says Felix is the best in a generation, and Stimson hires Frankfurter to be an assistant federal prosecutor in the Southern District, and that's completely transformational just in terms of that experience representing the federal government and having a mentor like Henry Stimson who instilled in him this idea that the highest calling one could have is public service and serving your country.
Can you tell us about some of his other forms of public service during the 1920s, like the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and how his relationship with Brandeis enabled him to participate in these activities?
Yeah, I'm sure. So Felix was really fortunate. After he's an assistant federal prosecutor, Stimson becomes Taft Secretary of War and brings Frankfurter down to Washington, D.C. as his assistant. And Frankfurter lives in a group house called the House of Truth, which was the subject of my last book. And Frankfurter—
a great book.
Thank you. But Frankfurter befriends Holmes and Brandeis. So here's this guy who's 26 years old. He's befriended Henry Stimson. He's befriended Henry Stimson's friend, former President Theodore Roosevelt, and now he's befriended his two judicial idols and practitioners of kind of believers in judicial restraint, Holmes and Brandeis. And Brandeis is kind of the people's lawyer who takes on public causes, really becomes a sort of exemplar for Felix. And what Brandeis also has is money. He's a multimillionaire, and he's been a very successful Boston lawyer, and he basically starts paying Felix money to engage in pro bono activity. And that occurs probably starting at about 1916, certainly once Felix joins the Harvard Law faculty in 1914, and it continues up until the time that Felix is on the Supreme Court of the United States in 1939. I think the most important thing, Laura, that Felix did in the 1920s was he took on the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer. He and Zachariah Chafee were appointed by a federal judge in Boston to be a friend of the court in representing some radical immigrants who were rounded up in the Palmer raids, which was a massive roundup of immigrants and radicals during the first Red Scare, and a lot of their Fourth Amendment rights were violated and Fifth Amendment rights were violated, and a lot of the evidence against them was quite thin about whether or not they posed a threat to the country. And Felix and Zechariah Chafee, who's a huge giant on First Amendment jurisprudence, they investigated the cases of these 21 immigrants, and they found all sorts of unconstitutional conduct by A. Mitchell Palmer and his henchman at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, and really exposed them. 17 of the 21 immigrants were not deported as a result of their investigation, and they had a public back and forth with the Attorney General, and that really, I think, made Felix's reputation as kind of a civil libertarian.
You
right?
think that's more important than Sacco and Vanzetti?
Well, I think that's, Sacco and Vanzetti, of course, is after that. The Palmer raids episodes in 21.
Right.
I think once Sacco and Vanzetti, who are two Italian anarchists who are convicted of robbery and murder of a paymaster of a shoe company in Massachusetts, people want Felix involved, right? They know his work on the Palmer raids, and people who are connected with the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee, they want Felix in, and he's kind of resistant at first until 1923, when he sees one of the appellate briefs and an admission by the ballistic experts hired by the prosecution that he had misled the jury. And at that point, the kind of former prosecutor in Felix kind of kicked in, and he's like, this wasn't fair. And he read the entire record, and he realized Sacco and Vanzetti hadn't had a fair trial. And in 1927, he writes a short book, sort of distilling the trial transcript in kind of lay language so the public can make up its mind before Sacco and Vanzetti are executed. And Felix becomes kind of public enemy number one in Boston for writing that book when the case is pending before the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And it's no longer about executing Sacco and Vanzetti. It's about, look what Felix Frankfurter, radical Jew, has done in sort of dishonoring the Massachusetts justice, the trial judge in the case, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court.
And the book does a really beautiful job of painting Frankfurter's image of himself and the public's image of him as a radical Jewish alien outsider. To go back to the inside, tell us about his relationship with FDR. You argue he creates a liberal establishment.
Yeah, I mean, I think he creates a liberal establishment even before he meets FDR, right? He starts teaching at Harvard Law School. They say, to a man, we want Frankfurter. He's the first Jewish professor at Harvard Law School. He's hired in 1914, and he very quickly befriends. He's young at the time. He's not married in 1914, and he befriends all these young Harvard Law Review editors, tells them stories of the House of Truth, and encourages them to go into government service. And he starts them on that path by choosing them to clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And then when Brandeis comes on the court in 1916, he starts choosing Brandeis's clerks. They're called secretaries. Each of them have one secretary. But that's a really coveted thing for these elite members of the Harvard Law Review. But it's more than that. It's trying to steer these young law students away from Wall Street law firms or Boston law firms or Chicago law firms or Washington law firms, and encouraging them to go work in the government instead. And that resonates during World War I from 1917 to 1919. And he sends a lot of students into the government during that era. And then that just continues into the 20s, right? And, Felix is really active in politics. In 1924, he supports a third-party candidate for president, Robert La Follette, and Lippmann kind of ridicules him. And Frankfurter's response is, Walter, I'm less concerned with 1924. I'm more concerned with 1944. And then, 4 years later, he supports Al Smith for president, and Smith gets trounced by Herbert Hoover. But in that election, Felix reestablishes ties with Franklin Roosevelt, whom he knew in the War Department during World War I. They had worked together in the War Department. And he realizes that when Roosevelt squeaks by and wins the New York governor's race in 1928, in the same election that Al Smith gets, just killed, that Franklin Roosevelt is the future of the Democratic Party, and that the Democratic Party will be the liberal party in America. Now, neither of those two things are obvious, right? 4 years later, in January, Walter Lippmann, writes a column and says Franklin Roosevelt's a lightweight and unfit to be president, right? And Felix sees it way back in 28 that Franklin Roosevelt's the future of the country, and begins advising him on all sorts of things.
Here as elsewhere, is it fair to say he's a bit of a courtier?
A courtier? Well, that sounds like he's kind of a supplicant, right? In some ways, I think he's more like a professor to Roosevelt, right? He's like Roosevelt can look past the kind of pedantic aspects of Felix's personality, right? The wanting to always teach someone something, and he's open to all of Frankfurter's ideas and solicits those ideas, right? I don't think Frankfurter, I don't think Roosevelt ever got offended by Frankfurter thinking that he was the smartest person in the room.
So tell us about the happy hot dogs and the role they played.
Right. So when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1932, it's only natural that Felix begins encouraging a lot of his current and former students to go into government, right? And it really even occurs before Roosevelt becomes president. He tried really hard to get Henry Friendly, who may have been his best former student ever, to enter the Hoover administration into the RFC, right? He wants,
and Corcoran's at the
right,
RFC.
and then Corcoran takes that job. Tom Corcoran is another one of Frankfurter's star students who ends up clerking for Holmes. Once Friendly turns down the RFC job, Corcoran takes it and becomes hugely influential. So, again, this whole happy hot dog thing starts World War I, continues into the 20s, through the Hoover administration. And then once the New Deal begins and all these administrative agencies need lawyers, as our friend Dan Ernst has written about and continues to write about in eloquent ways, all of these former Harvard Law students enter the administration. And there's a sense, though, Laura, and this happy hot dog thing starts as a funny play on Felix's first and last name. And it begins to take on a kind of anti-Semitic cast. Little midway through the New Deal, General Johnson, the former head of the NRA, starts to wield it in a way that makes Frankfurter look like a Rasputin-like figure in the New Deal. And people start to refer to the New Deal as the Jew deal, right? Because there are a number of Jewish students who can't get into Wall Street law firms who are going into government.
Frankfurter saw this as a way of enfranchising a generation of Jews and Irish Catholics who couldn't find elite jobs in private practice, as well as creating a public service bar, right?
No doubt. That's a super great point about the Jews and Irish Catholics. You're totally right. There are a lot of outsiders who enter the New Deal because they don't fit the mold of what these law firms are looking for. But he's got a kind of plan for these elite students, and the plan does not involve a New York law firm, right? Henry Friendly breaks his heart by going to the Root Clark law firm because Frankfurter wants him to do graduate work with him as a get a PhD, go clerk for Brandeis, and then go either onto the law faculty or into government, right? Law firms aren't really the plan that Felix has for his elite students. He sees government as really the highest possible calling.
And what's its role during the court fight?
During the court, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, first of all, you even before the court fight in 1935, during what, as you know, Laura, historians call the Second New Deal, after the Supreme Court of the United States.
You hate that.
I know you hate the phrase, but I historians use it. It's after the first set of New Deal programs get struck down in 1935. Frankfurter spends the whole summer of 1935 at the White House, working with legislators, working with Sam Rayburn in the House, working with John Nance Garner and others in the Senate, and getting Roosevelt's second set of legislation passed. So he's really involved in policy making. And Laura, you're the expert on court packing, not me, but you know, Roosevelt keeps Frankfurter in the dark about the court packing plan and says, look, you're going to be in for a shock soon. And he says, you know, all I ask is that, you know, you reserve judgment until we've had a chance to talk. And so Roosevelt announces the court packing plan. Felix has no prior knowledge that it's about to come down. And Felix was not in favor of the court packing plan on the merits, but FDR asked him to remain neutral, and Felix agreed. But at the same time, Felix was really angry at the Supreme Court of the United States. He thought the justices had become politicians in robes by letting their animus toward the New Deal and their animus toward Roosevelt guide some of their decision-making in cases in 1935 and 1936. And he was providing ammunition to Roosevelt and others in the administration, basically making the case against the Supreme Court. He was not willing to make the case for court packing, but he was willing to help make the case against the Supreme Court. He also said he got a lot of criticism for this, Laura. His really good friends, as you know, Grenville Clark, who was one of his classmates and one of the founders of the Root Clark law firm, and C.C. Burlingham, one of the lions of the New York bar and a friend of his, were all over him. They're like, you have to say something about how wrong this is. And he writes this letter, Laura, I know you've seen it, to Grenville Clark, and says, look, you know, I'm already the Jew and the red. Whatever I say is, and the alien, right? The alien and the Jew and the red, right? Whatever I say is going to get misconstrued, and I'm going to become the focus, and it's not, and the legislation is not going to be the focus. And that's his justification for them to staying on the sidelines. A less charitable view is that there was some kind of quid pro quo between Frankfurter and Roosevelt. And I don't think that's true. And I don't think you do either. That Roosevelt never said, if you keep your mouth shut, I'll put you on the Supreme Court. I sort of adopted Alex Bickle's view, who's one of Frankfurter's, you know, closest proteges, that Frankfurter really stayed quiet out of his loyalty to Roosevelt, that Roosevelt had asked him to stay quiet, and there was such a deep bond there that Frankfurter wasn't going to say anything. One last thing about court packing, Laura, because your book is FDR's Gambit is such an amazing book. And the reason why it's amazing, for those of you who haven't read it, is it looks at the court packing plan through the eyes of the members of Congress. And Laura's been to archives all over the country of senators and congressmen looking at court packing from a completely different vantage point. And I didn't do nearly that sort of Herculean effort in my own book, but I do think I made a contribution in the book about court packing. And the point of view in my book really about court packing is the way court packing fractured the relationship between Frankfurter and Brandeis. They had been what Brandeis called, they had a half-brother, half-son relationship ever since about 1911 or so. And they almost stopped being friends because of the court packing plan. Brandeis thought, I think somewhat rightly, that Roosevelt was, that Frankfurter was too close to the Roosevelt administration and couldn't, and was siding with the administration rather than speaking out against the court packing plan. And I think Frankfurter was annoyed with Brandeis for some of his votes. in some
Yeah.
of the cases in 1935 and 1936,
Yeah.
that Brandeis's whole curse of bigness philosophy, that anything that was big was bad, and that Brandeis sort of failed to exercise the kind of judicial restraint that James Bradley Thayer talked about in his 1893 essay. So I really wrote about their personal relationship and how
Wonderful.
and how really court packing tested it, and I think irreparably changed their relationship. I don't think they were ever as close after court packing. I
Right.
think Brandeis was reluctant to retire and make way for Frankfurter on the court because of the court packing plan. So I think court packing had a lot of ramifications for Felix and for Brandeis.
Well, so how does this red Jewish alien come to sit on the court?
It's
And
amazing.
how does his appointment change the confirmation process?
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable, right? When FDR becomes president in 32, and really in early 33, he asks Frankfurter to be his Solicitor General. And he says, look, Felix, I really want to put you on the Supreme Court, but I can't put a Jew who's best known for defending Sacco and Vanzetti on the Supreme Court of the United States, and a law professor. I'm going to get killed, right? And he says, if you're Solicitor General representing the government, it's going to be a much easier sell, right? And of course, Roosevelt's second nominee, Stanley Reed, was his Solicitor General, right? And but Roosevelt, after about a year of infighting after Cardozo's death, between the kind of old line Democrats like Farley, Jim Farley and Attorney General Cummings on one side, and the kind of young Turk New Dealers led by Robert Jackson and Ben Cohen and Tom Corcoran on the other side, are fighting for Frankfurter. And the old line Democrats are like, no, we need a Catholic from the West. We don't need a Jew from the Northeast, right? And so it's remarkable that he's even nominated, to be honest with you. And then his confirmation hearing, as you alluded to, is really just a circus, right? He's the first justice who ever testifies in an open-ended way. Harlan Fistone testified about one case when he was Attorney General, but Frankfurter is the first Supreme Court nominee to testify in open-ended hearings against his will at the request of the Senate. And it's just a circus. Every red baiting wackadoodle comes out of the woodwork, led by a woman named Elizabeth Dilling, whose sort of professional job is to kind of hunt down secret communists. And during the middle of her testimony, she accuses members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, including Burton Wheeler, and she accuses FDR and Eleanor, all of being communists. And at that point, she was basically done, right? But be that as it may, Pat McCarran was on that Senate Judiciary Committee. He's a senator from Nevada. He was very much like Joe McCarthy before McCarthy,
right.
Just a kind of crazy nativist, anti-Semitic, sees communism under the bed kind of person. And he really went after Frankfurter hard. And Frankfurter, being the professor, really enjoyed the kind of back and forth with McCarran and almost had fun with him. But there's no vote on Frankfurter's nomination.
Right.
He's confirmed by voice vote. And I think that's a way for the Senate to kind of save face and not want to have to say which senators voted for or against him.
Well, what were liberal expectations for Frankfurter once he got on the court, and how well did he satisfy them?
Well, I'd say those expectations were impossible, right? I think the two people who really sealed the deal for Frankfurter to get nominated were Robert Jackson, who at that point was Solicitor General, and a sitting Justice Harlan Fistone. And they were basically telling Roosevelt, we need someone to stand up to the Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes. We need someone who can guide the liberal wing of the Supreme Court. And, the fact of the matter is no one was going to stand up to Charles Evans Hughes. He was too good at his job, right? And I think it's what you're alluding to, Laura. The issues sort of changed on Frankfurter overnight, right? The issues were no longer about what was the scope of the federal government's power. That had been decided during the New Deal constitutional crisis in 1937 and a few years later. And by the time Felix gets on the court in 1939, it's not about the federal government's power, but it's about protecting individual rights. And I think those are questions that Felix, as someone who believed in Thayer's theory, saw as in tension with deferring to the democratic political process.
There's so much I'd like to ask you about his court years. But can you talk a little bit about his relationship with his colleagues? Because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think what Laura really means by that nice question is she thinks Felix annoyed all of his colleagues, right? He did. So I would push back, obviously, Laura, hard. He annoyed some colleagues by being professorial and by being pedantic, by being a know-it-all, by being a very argumentative person, and that turned some colleagues off in a big way. But he was very early on.
Who were they?
Well, I mean, William O. Douglas, who was one of these young New Dealers who was, advocating for Roosevelt to nominate Frankfurter and was appointed to the court shortly after Frankfurter in 1939 when Brandeis retired within weeks of Frankfurter joining the court. William O. Douglas just couldn't stand him. There was a real clash of personalities. Frankfurter thought, I think, somewhat rightly, that Douglas's votes were in many ways influenced by his aspirations to succeed FDR as president. And he held on to this idea in 1944 and 1948 that he was going to be the Democratic presidential nominee. And Felix didn't like that. Now, at the same time, Felix has his own conflicts. He's advising FDR and the administration while he's on the Supreme Court. He's advising Henry Stimson, who's back in the War Department as the head during World War II, and John McCloy, Stimson's assistant, and that's totally wrong. As I wrote in the book, Korematsu at the time is a hard case, but Felix shouldn't even have been there because he was advising the War Department. The Nazi saboteurs case was a hard case, but Felix shouldn't have even been on the case because he was advising Henry Stimson about what to hold a military commission. And I really fault Frankfurter for that. I think he crossed too many ethical lines, and I think he saw other people crossing ethical lines like Douglas and got annoyed. And I think he should have looked in the mirror during those war years and said, hey, maybe I shouldn't sit on Korematsu. Hey, maybe I shouldn't sit on in ex parte Kirin, the Nazi saboteurs case. And he would have been better off that way. I think if he were to push back on us, we know how World War II came out, right? We know the Nazis lost. And Frankfurter saw this as an existential threat. And he saw this as the war for civilization. And he had an uncle that he had rescued from a Nazi prison through State Department contacts in 1938. He had people who were being victimized by the Nazis, and he thought the ends justified the means in helping out Stimson and McCloy. I'm not justifying what Frankfurter did. I think his ethics were off base in sitting on those cases, but I think he would say, maybe I didn't pay as much attention writing opinions. Maybe I crossed some ethical lines advising members of the War Department, but the most important thing was to defeat the Nazis, to defeat the Axis powers, and to defeat fascism. And so I just think it's easy to sit back and say he shouldn't have done all those stuff, but we didn't know who was going to win that war.
And very different from what Douglas was doing in his politics. I mean, Frankfurter wasn't trying to get elected president. There are so many more questions, but before we jump to audience questions, can you tell us what surprised you most about researching the book and what surprised you most about Frankfurter?
I think the most fun I had, Laura, was a 4-day trip I took when I had small children to England. The first thing was Isaiah Berlin's letters were a great source for me, because Joseph Alsop was writing Isaiah Berlin, all the gossip that was happening with the Georgetown set, and Marion Frankfurter from her and Felix's time in England for a year as the Eastman Fellow at Oxford were very close to Isaiah Berlin, and she had a really close intellectual relationship with Berlin, and she would write him very intimate letters about what was going on, and that was amazing. And so that Anglophile piece was super interesting, but also the 3 young British children of a former student who helped write his Sacco Vanzetti book. When they take them in during the Blitz, during the bombing of London in 1940, that just showed me a different side of Felix as someone who loved children, and he and Marion were in many ways wonderful parents, even though they didn't fit the kind of they were childless, and you wouldn't think at their age that they would be good parents, but they really were. And maybe the most marvelous thing I got to do was visit with the youngest of those 3 British children, who was sort of the apple of the eye of Marion and Felix Frankfurter, Oliver Gates. And Oliver Gates has since passed away of cancer since the books come out. But I just feel so privileged. He not only let me into his home, he had me stay overnight. I got to look at all of the books that he had inscribed by Frankfurter, all the letters from Felix and Marion during the war. It was just an amazing thing, and it really opened up a window to Frankfurter I'd never thought I'd see. I just feel like a fortunate human being to have known Oliver Gates.
Well, can you talk a bit about Frankfurter's role in Brown versus Board of Education and how important he was?
Yeah, I will, and I know we want to get to Baker, and then I promise we'll end. But in Brown, when Richard Kluger wrote his marvelous book, a lot of Frankfurter's law clerks talked to Kluger, and he kind of played a starring role in the book. And then there was kind of a reaction to that, Laura, as you know, and the revisionists kind of said, hey, they started to really believe Justice Douglas's conference notes that Frankfurter was somehow going to come out the other way in Brown versus Board of Education, and changed his mind. And I really pushed back on that idea, that Frankfurter really played a critical role in achieving unanimity for Brown. And we can debate on whether or not unanimity was a good thing in that case. But for the entire 52 term, the first time it was argued, and Fred Vinson was the chief, it was Frankfurter who dispatched his clerk, Alex Bickle, to write about the history of the 14th Amendment. It was Frankfurter who implored his colleagues to re-argue the case, and drafted with Bickle the questions for re-argument. And really, Earl, what I really push back on, and I'm not denigrating Earl Warren, he's one of the great chief justices of the 20th century, and the subject of your next Holmes Devise volume, Laura, that I can't wait to read. But this idea that Earl Warren on his own, as this kind of skillful politician, an amateur constitutional lawyer, could somehow by cult of personality achieve unanimity, just seems super unrealistic, particularly, Laura, the timing. Warren was a recess appointment to the Supreme Court by Eisenhower. He's not confirmed until February. And really, during that February to May period is where everything happens. And really instrumental in achieving Brown's unanimity is both Felix and Hugo Black, who have enormous influence on Earl Warren during those critical months. And I really tried to show the positive role Felix played during that process, particularly with Robert Jackson, who would have been a close confidant of Warren's, because they belonged to the same private club in California, is within the hospital during that point of time. So it made Felix and Hugo's role even more important. So this idea that Felix somehow was anti-Brown is just incorrect.
But then he does become estranged from the Warren court. And I guess my last question would be, how does Baker v. Carr complete his estrangement from the court?
Yeah, I think that estrangement, Laura, really begins in the Red Monday cases in 1957, where he sees the court. He doesn't have a problem with the way the court decides the case, the outcome. It's the kind of the way the opinions are written. He sees the court kind of aggrandizing its own power at the expense of the other branches, and that to him, he's completely against this idea of judicial supremacy, the idea that the Supreme Court has the last word on the Constitution. And really, I think where he kind of broke with the Warren Court was in Cooper versus Aaron, where in Justice Brennan's opinion, Justice Brennan claims that the Supreme Court is the supreme expositor of the Constitution. He cites Marbury versus Madison, and Frankfurter and Harlan go crazy over that. And, Frankfurter kind of writes separately, annoying all of his colleagues in the Cooper case, because he really wants to write more in the register of, hey, governors are supposed to follow the rule of law and federal court orders, not because the Supreme Court has the last word on the Constitution. And Brennan really doubles down on that idea in Baker versus Carr, Laura. He says in Baker versus Carr, as you know, he says the Supreme Court is, quote, the ultimate constitutional interpreter, and again cites Marbury, in my opinion, totally out of context. And that idea is just an anathema to Frankfurter, that the Supreme Court is all powerful in interpreting the Constitution. Frankfurter believes that the executive branch and the Congress play co-equal roles in interpreting the Constitution, particularly when it comes to the 14th Amendment, with Section 5 giving Congress a textual basis to interpret the amendment. So I think, Baker versus Carr was a culmination of things that were brewing in 57 and 58. And by the time we get to 62 in Baker, he thinks, the Supreme Court's not going to be liberal forever. Was his big point to his law clerks. He sees during the bulk of his life the Supreme Court as a backward-looking, reactionary institution, and he's worried about aggrandizing the court's power.
Thank you. I think we have time for some questions.
Laura, I'd love to hear your Frankfurter skepticism if we don't have questions. I'd welcome counterpoint.
We do. I mean, I can't stand his handwriting. I can't stand his personality. I can't stand his operation as a drag on the Warren Court. I can't, he just rubs me the wrong way.
Says the leading constitutional historian of her time. So
No. Well, tell me what you think. Here's a question. Here's a question. Why do I hate the Second New Deal? I hate the Second New Deal because I don't think it's very accurate. I think the entire New Deal was organized around the creation of security, and that many of the qualities that we see at work in the Second New Deal of 1935 are really apparent in the earlier in the New Deal. So it just doesn't, I don't think it's very accurate. And here's another question. After Frankfurter, which justice has most closely embodied his judicial personality as one you like, besides Harold Burton?
Well, that's a hard question. Let me stick to justices who aren't on the current court. Okay, so Jim Duff doesn't levitate from his chair. I think Justice Breyer and Justice Frankfurter are similar in the sense that there's an incrementalism in both of them. So and I think they come out of the same Harvard tradition. They're both sort of process theorists. And although Frankfurter, you wouldn't use that term at the time, it's a little anachronistic
Yeah.
to call Frankfurter a process theorist. But I do think I do think that they are similar in some respects, and Breyer's respectful of precedent, and I think one of the way Frankfurter tries to curb judicial power is to respect precedent.
Another question. Can you tell us more about the missing Frankfurter diaries and papers in the Library of Congress, which you wonderfully whose return you wonderfully call for in your acknowledgement?
Yeah, Frankfurter's diaries and papers, some of which were stolen from the Library of Congress Manuscript Division when they were in a different building without the kind of security cameras they have now, and there was a public call for their return by Jack Anderson in the Washington Post. Some of the documents were returned. We know that because they have an X in the corner of those documents, but some were not. And whomever stole those documents knew what he or she was doing. They were someone who knew a lot about archival material, because some really valuable things of historical importance were stolen. Frankfurter's diaries from 1927, at the height of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, were stolen, and Frankfurter's diary from 1937 and the New Deal constitutional crisis were stolen, and a whole host of Frankfurter's correspondence with Hugo Black was stolen. So, I just hope that whoever has stolen them before he or she dies will sort of say, hey, I don't need to go to my grave with these, that historians of the future would really benefit from these documents. And I just hope that person or persons will return them at some point, or even if that those people's families, if they find those documents, will return them, and the Library of Congress would take them back, no questions asked.
And as you point out, the statute of limitations is told.
Well, I mean, I think so. I don't want to give legal advice, but I don't think I think that the chance of prosecution is infinitesimally small. The justice's papers are not governed by the Federal Records Act the way the papers are at the National Archives. So that's a big difference in terms of criminal prosecution.
Now, here's another question that you said you debate whether unanimity in Brown was really so important. And for example, Justin Driver has suggested it wasn't. What is the argument for the proposition that unanimity was good or bad?
I think it's really more Justin's argument, not mine. And I'm a huge fan of Justin's work, as I am yours, Laura. Justin, I think, rightly suggests that the court, in order to achieve unanimity, had to write Brown in a certain way, right? For example, they limited the opinion to education rather than interpreting what the 14th Amendment means broadly, rather than, for example, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is not explicitly overruled in Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
There is not a broad-based principle of either what today we would call anti-subordination or anti-classification articulated about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And maybe that would have sacrificed one or two votes, but I think it would have been better long-term, and agree with Justin, if we had more interpretation of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. And I think that fell by the wayside when their primary motivation was unanimity. The other thing I would just add as a counterpoint, Laura, it's easy to say today that unanimity is overrated. But Justin's written eloquently about the Southern Manifesto in the Texas Law Review, and you just had a fierce opposition to Brown that they knew was coming. And so, they were kind of covering their flanks by being unanimous and limiting it to education. And, but the problem was the Southern Manifesto was a very legalistic document, analyzing Brown based on text, history, precedent, and structure. And the Brown opinion didn't really do that. And that was one of its real weaknesses. So that's what I think Justin's sort of saying, is
Right.
that we could have used
Right.
more about text, history, precedent, and structure, and less about kind of the importance of education in our society.
So this is the last question before we wrap up. Someone wants to know what you're working on next.
Well, that's a nice question for them to answer. I'll say I'm working on a book on Angelo Herndon, who was a Black communist who in Atlanta in 1932, who was organizing unemployed Black and white workers, and was charged with a capital crime of attempting to incite insurrection. And that case twice goes before the Supreme Court of the United States, once in 1935 and 1937. I just want to reiterate for people that they should buy your book, Laura, FDR's Gambit, and that like most, I've read it, it's amazing. And I'm eagerly awaiting the definitive history of the Warren Court that you're writing about, the Holmes Device series, and the rest of us are all better off for your having done that. So thanks for that.
Thank you so much, Brad. And I just want to reiterate that though you didn't quite make me like Frankfurter, you did make me appreciate him a bit more. And I love your book.
Thanks, Laura. That's nice of you to say.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Professor Snyder and Kalman, for this engaging conversation tonight. You have our sincere gratitude, not only for this wonderful presentation tonight and the discussion, which is very stimulating, but for all you're doing to preserve Supreme Court history. We're in your debt, and we're very grateful for the hard work you all do. It's very thorough, and we enjoy it tremendously. So we can't wait to have you on other programs. We do have signed copies of both of the professor's books in our gift shop, Professor Snyder's books, including Democratic Justice, which I'm going to hold up and let you know that it's available in our gift shop at www.supremecourtgifts.org. We also have copies of Professor Kalman's latest book, FDR's Gambit, which they discussed this evening, in stock at our gift shop. Our next virtual program is on November 16th at noon, when Professor Christopher Bonner of the University of Maryland discusses Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship. Registration is available at the Society's website at www.supremecourthistory.org. And a reminder now that a survey will go out later this evening to everyone who registered in advance for the program. Please do respond to that survey. We want to make these programs as useful and accessible as possible to as many people as possible. We thank you all for joining us tonight. And again, a hearty thanks to Professor Snyder and Kalman for this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, are we off?